I'm going to go ahead and get started because I know we have lots of awesome information to share, so I don't want to waste any of our precious minutes. But I just wanted to introduce myself to, I think at this point, everybody knows I do this a lot. So I'm Patty Koval, the Director of Member Networking and Learning, and so glad that you all could be here with us for this second of our series. And if you want to count the session, the overwhelmingly popular session at the conference on impact investing, then technically this is kind of our third. But without much introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our two co-chairs of this session, Stephanie Randolph and Deb Markley. And the last session that we did about the board, then you all remember that it was Chris Crothers and Debbie Casemeyer. So this is our fearsome foursome of folks who are helping us navigate all these impact investing waters and opportunities to learn. So thank you all for being here. And Stephanie, do you want me to turn it to you?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Stephanie Randolph. I work for the Cassiopeia Foundation in Charlottesville, Virginia. We are at times also historically known as Blue Moon Fund, or sometimes going forward as Purple Tiger. All are in the same hat and same family. I was lucky enough to come here 8 years ago into a foundation that had a deep history of impact investing across the financial return spectrum, dating back to the 1980s. And if there's one thing I've learned, that one experience is exactly that, one experience. I have seen a foundation with deep experience continue to wrestle with the hows, the whys, the tools, and which ones are right when. So I'm really excited and appreciative to VFN for bringing this community together so that we can all continue to learn and grow with one another. Before I turn it over to Deb, just wanted to give you a little highlights of where we're going. We're going to do a quick recap of the previous two sessions that have happened through Virginia Funders Network. We're going to take a look at the unique role philanthropy can play in the impact investing ecosystem. We'll break down some key terms and examine how capital flows to worthy community investments. And then we want to highlight some common gaps and provide examples of how foundations in the Commonwealth have actually helped overcome those gaps. Then we'll dive deep into some stories that have happened in the region, hear how they happened, what worked, and what we would all do differently. We're also lucky to have Leah Freeman here from the Virginia Cdfi Coalition. And Leah is going to talk about who are our ecosystem partners and how do we all work together, ultimately make our lives easier, our jobs easier, and improve our community wellness and community well-being. And then we're going to give you some tangible steps and actions for going forward. Deb, do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm Deb Markley. I'm Senior Vice President at Locus Impact Investing. I am headquartered in North Carolina, but as many of you know, Locus is part of Virginia Community Capital VCC Social Enterprises. And so we have done a lot of work in Virginia and increasingly are working with foundations in Virginia. Locus works with place-based foundations across the country. And so as we go forward today, we're going to hear a couple of examples Stephanie is going to give of some foundations from across the country, some of their investments, and happy to bring some of those insights into the conversation today. Stephanie, do you want me to go right to the poll?
Yes, I think that'd be great. Let's find out who's here.
We thought it'd be great to launch this poll to just get a sense of who's in the room, so to speak. And so just a single question asking where your foundation is in your local impact investing journey. So if you could take a moment to just check where you think you are, that would be great. And thanks to Angie for helping with the poll. Angie, you can give me, I don't think I can actually see how the results are coming in, so we'll just keep it open for a minute or so.
Can everybody else see the poll on their screen? Okay, great.
Good. Everybody about done? We can share the results and see who's in the room.
You guys don't mind adding or trying that out. For some reason, it did not capture results. So
Maybe this time we verbally share the results.
yeah, I don't see it capturing anybody's results. So we
Okay.
might have to share that.
Well, yeah,
I
Okay.
see the results.
I
Oh,
do. too.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, if you guys don't mind sharing the
Yeah.
results.
Well, I'm not sure how. Let me hit
Yeah,
share.
yeah, that's what I was.
Oh, there you go. Great. So we have about a quarter of you or so are in education phase with staff and board. A good number of you are exploring program design and strategy. We're excited to hear that. A few or about a third of you have already deployed investments or are getting ready to deploy. So that's actually really exciting to me to see the energy here, and it speaks well to the opportunity to really build this community of practice here in Virginia. Awesome. Well, thank you for doing that. I'm going to turn it back to Stephanie to give us some grounding before we dig into a couple of investments.
Hold on here. There we go. I am feeling technologically challenged today. There we go. So moving on to our session recaps. What has happened in the previous 2 sessions? And I'll say there was also a specific session for community foundations that I didn't list here that has happened. Virginia Funders Network is awesome in that they do have a YouTube channel. So underlined on this sheet are links to YouTube channels when you get these slides mailed to you. And that community foundation session is also in that same YouTube channel from VFN. But the first session, which was really an amazing session, took place at the first conference. And it really provided an overview to impact investing, helping us set the stage for how to have a successful conversation. And first and foremost, it acknowledged that there are so many definitions and terms and ranges of definitions and terms for the same words that it really makes these conversations complex. So for the purposes of our conversations with a VFN, we are going to define impact as investing as an intentional capital deployment strategy that works to leverage the power of capital to create positive change with specific intentional impacts. And during that session, we also featured 5 of our fellow members who are already doing impact investing in the region. And they each spent about 7 minutes telling the story about the investment that they made. So if you want to hear about that, go and check out the link. The second session was 2 weeks ago and was hosted by Chris and Debbie, which Angie referenced a few minutes ago. And that was called Getting Your Board on Board. The session really focused on how do you begin your research? How do you anticipate common barriers? And then they presented a range of ideas for how you could build out successful conversations with your board and a timeline with goals that included developing an investment policy statement that included your impact investing strategies. It focused on helping you clarify your theory of change and talked about the legal and staffing structures that might be necessary to help you implement your strategy. Today, we're going to highlight how you can begin impact investing now, utilizing a learning by doing approach. It's really a matter of the long game versus the short game. The long game is what Chris and Debbie presented, and it really allows you to embrace the community investor mindset. It helps you build your investment policy statement that considers your mission for both your 95%, your corpus, and your 5%, our traditional grant making dollars. And then it leverages both parts of your capital to advance impact. And it often includes investments in both Wall Street as well as your main streets. The short game is a series of smaller steps that Deb and I are going to focus on today that allows you to learn to think like a community investor. It includes a range of tools as well as alternative grant-making strategies. And often it's more collaborative internally with your staff as well as externally with other community partners. It builds comfort with different levels of risk within your foundation, gives you an opportunity to demonstrate impact, and it helps you clarify your values and priorities. As the bottom of the slide says, this is not a one or the other. This is really a yes and, so that you can kind of learn and do as you're building that long vision that you want to hold as the ideal. So what is philanthropy's role in the community investment ecosystem? And really, what is a community investment ecosystem, you might be asking? Well, we believe that our communities already have all of the assets they need, or many of the assets they need, to realize the visions and opportunities that we've been discussing and dreaming of. The community investment ecosystem refers to the key actors, resources, and supporting conditions that enable the flow of investment capital to our community priorities. It includes the people and organizations that help shape the projects and get them ready for investment. It's the financial intermediaries, including our Cdfis, our banks, foundations, state and federal partners, as well as investors that provide forms of capital, as well as all of the supporting conditions, all of which can constrain or encourage the flow of community-focused investment. For the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to focus on the financial resources and how do we activate the full spectrum of capital needed to advance community investment. The spectrum of capital, when you look at philanthropy historically, has been siloed between the left and the right side of this chart. On the left-hand side, we have our grants, which are measured almost entirely by the impact that it creates. There's little or no consideration for the financial return on capital or even the return of capital. 100% of those dollars go out and we never see that financial capital again. But we are expecting social or environmental returns in exchange. On the other side of the spectrum, the consideration is strictly financial. There's little or no consideration for the positive or negative impacts that that investment might create. This is a historic model. I think we've all seen it and we know it. But really, it creates division between our staff, where program staff is evaluated on impact and finance staff is evaluated on financial returns, leaving little room for collaboration or experimentation. This is in part due to an interpretation of our fiduciary duty or the prudent investor rule, which often required a devout focus on financial returns. But thanks to several Treasury rulings dating back to 2016, and MIFA expressly permits fiduciaries to take into account an asset's special relationship or value to an institution's charitable purpose, which clarifies that charitable organizations may make investments to programs that have program-related purposes, but are not entirely program-related. Or to put this in a little bit more plain English, fiduciaries may consider the values and charitable mission of our organizations, as well as the well-being of our beneficiaries, including the social and environmental impacts when making our financial decisions. This creates for me, and hopefully you, a lot of fun space in between the left side and the right side of the spectrum, where we can begin to collaborate more internally, and we can work a little bit differently with our community partners. The reality is, to make these high impact community projects happen, we need capital from a range of sources that are working across this return spectrum. How all of these capital sources are combined is often referred to as the capital stack. Community projects and high impact businesses often require a blending of funding and financing, and I work hard to catch myself distinguishing between those two terms so that we know what we're talking about. I define funding as capital that is being provided that has no expectation of being paid back. Financing, I would describe as capital investments that have an expectation of being paid back. They, of course, have different levels of risk and financial return, but how all of those sources of funding and financing come together can be referred to as the capital stack. Understanding your or your foundation's financial return expectations, along with the return expectations of our community partners and potential investors can help community projects work more effectively to assemble the mix of capital that they need to make high impact projects happen in our community. No two capital stacks are alike, and not all projects need all of these pieces. But the capital stack provides a framework for how partners in an investment ecosystem can work together, and allows you to begin to focus on where the common gaps exist and where we need to work together to solve them. Let's take a few examples that have been given to us by Deb and her team at Locus. In Hastings, Michigan, we have an example of how a bank, a community foundation, and private investors have worked together to make a $4.7 million project a reality in their community. Hastings is just outside of Grand Rapids. Gun Lake is a major attraction and a popular leisure place. There was no hotel nearby. And many of these people in the community viewed this as an economic development challenge or an economic development opportunity, if we want to bring the asset lens to our conversation. So a set of entrepreneurs and a local bank approached the local bank and the Barry Community Foundation with this opportunity. Let's build a Holiday Inn. And through a series of co-investments, they were able to build a hotel, which now serves as an economic driver and asset for the community, but also serves as a community facility, even holding swim lessons for the kids throughout the year. Here's how the capital stack worked out. In this case, the equity investors were able to bring over $500,000 to the table. The bank was interested in lending, but likely had either lending limits or perhaps the interest rate at the bank was offering was a little too high for the full amount. So the community foundation was able to come in and provide a subordinate loan alongside the bank to help fill that gap and make this investment a reality. In a second example, an issue that is close to all of our hearts that I think everyone is dealing with, we have an example of how multiple community partners came together to address a $500,000 gap that was inhibiting the expansion of broadband and wireless to over 7,500 homes. The need for broadband in Hutchinson, Kansas was well known, as it is in many communities, but COVID amplified that and presented an opportunity to bring new partners to the table to get this deal done. So it was approximately a $400,000 need. There was a $500,000 gap because IdeaTech, the local broadband provider, was willing to provide $3.5 million of equity towards this expansion of their service area. Then, as a part of the COVID response, as we saw in many communities, the United Way and the Economic Development Authority were willing to make grants to expand broadband and wireless access in the communities. Then we had a community foundation and the Kansas Community Investment Fund each take smaller segments of that remaining amount and issue loans to IdeaTech to enable the help cover the upfront costs of the expansion. They were both confident in this case that IdeaTech would be able to repay the loan because they were gaining more customers who would be paying over time. But the heavy upfront cost was the barrier, as was this $500,000. And COVID presented an opportunity where 4 partners through 4 different financial vehicles could help fill the gap and make this project a reality in the community. Deb, would you like to take over for a few minutes? You're on mute.
I'll come off mute first and then take over. I want to make sure that I've been trying to monitor the chat, make sure that there's no questions that come up. Before we jump into 2 transactions here, I do want to make one point. Stephanie talked about that the capital stack and with a real focus on financial capital. One thing, because I know both of these transactions pretty well, the other form of capital, if you will, particularly with the Hutchinson one, was that the Hutchinson Community Foundation had to do none of the due diligence, none of the structuring of this deal, because they had financial institution, the Kansas Community Investment Fund, they had other financial intermediary partners that brought that kind of capital and expertise to the table. So yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of focus here on the financial capital side of it in this next bit. But when we talk to Leah for a few minutes, you'll see that these intermediaries that exist in the ecosystem bring both capital as well as some expertise that can be really helpful for you getting started. So I just wanted to add that. What we want to do now, as long as there's no questions for what Stephanie shared, and again, all of the slides and things will be coming out to you along with the recording as a follow-up. We want to go deep on two different foundation stories, two different investments, if you will. It's my understanding that coming out of the conference session this in June, was it, I guess? May or June?
May.
May, was a real desire to dig deep and get under the hood and really understand how some of these transactions happen. And so we've asked DeWitt House from the Harvest Foundation to join us. And I'm going to start with DeWitt. And we're going to just do this as a conversation. But we want to start by having DeWitt talk a little bit about, if you could just kind of place the Harvest Foundation within the state, talk a little bit about your service area. And then just at a very high level, what's the deal that we're going to be talking about today? And then we're just going to have a dialogue. I'll throw some questions at you, DeWitt, and we'll go forward. But just introduce yourself and the Harvest Foundation to make sure everybody understands where you are.
Again, DeWitt House. I'm a senior program officer here at the Harvest Foundation in Martinsville, Virginia. We're located in Southside, Virginia, right along the North Carolina border. We are a health conversion foundation. Local hospital was sold in 2001. The foundation was set up, and we serve Martinsville and Henry County, which Martinsville City is surrounded by Henry County. That's our footprint. That's our service area. We work in education. We do also economic development, community revitalization, and various other things. Health is another area that we focus on as well.
Good. We're going to dig into the work that you've done to help make the 5 Points neighborhood a reality. So can you tell us a little bit about this opportunity and how it came to the foundation?
We held a housing summit. Our local leaders had gotten together and identified 3 specific areas that we needed to address in our community, and housing was the number one thing. So we brought together a lot of the local developers, financiers, bankers. We brought people from Virginia Housing and DHCD from the state of Virginia to Martinsville in 2019 and had a housing summit. Coming out of the housing summit, Virginia Housing had an innovative housing grant, $500,000 grant that we decided to, in partnership with Martinsville City, to apply for. And the city was our major partner in this project. We have a local manufacturer of modular homes, high-end modular homes, or mid-level, nationwide homes. And so they came on board as a partner as well. And the project kind of just took a life of its own from there with the grant from Virginia Housing.
So what's the process that you used at the foundation to really consider the merits of this investment and what your role might be? Who was involved in that process and how did you get there?
Well, we started out with our grants committee, and the staff here put together a proposal for the grants committee. And then the grants committee decided that, this was an investment that we wanted to make, especially we started out, ideally we were looking at 27 different homes, 15 townhomes and 12 cottage style homes at anywhere from 1,000 to 1,100 square feet. And then from there, we started pulling together, with the grant, with Nationwide Homes, who was the builder, and then Silver Point, which is the installer, and then the city as our major partner. The city handled all of the permitting, it did a lot of the legal work and so forth in terms of getting the project started.
Great. So what was the investment that the foundation made that made this happen? And how
Well,
did you structure
in
that?
in that process, building, we had the $500,000 grant, which was primarily to help with the site cost of site preparation, some down payment assistance, things of that nature. But when Nationwide manufactures the home and it comes off the line, they really you have to order a home and then they manufacture it, and then the process starts. They get paid as soon as the home comes off the line. Well, in this case, we were trying to develop this small neighborhood, so Nationwide couldn't really afford to build all these homes because they weren't pre-ordered. So when they came off the line, somehow or another, we had to try. They could carry them for 30 to 60 days, but if we didn't sell them within that time, we had a problem. So what the foundation did was the foundation worked with the city and the city's housing authority, and homes that didn't sell within 30 to 60 days, we put together $1 million fund, which we built 5 homes at a time. And said, so when we purchased the 5, when they built the 5, the city had the money to purchase them if they weren't immediately sold. And then once they sell, then that money comes back to the housing authority and then back to the foundation. So we were kind of a backstop.
Because DeWitt, I had a chance to talk with a person from Nationwide Homes when I was visiting you all a few months back. I think there's 2 really interesting pieces to this. One is that Nationwide Homes did this at a lower profit margin for themselves because this is their place. It was in some ways they had some skin in the game, if you will, in terms of that capital stack that Stephanie showed. But the other thing that I thought was really important is that, and what makes the foundation's investment so important is their commitment to actually build a community, not to build a house. And so the real impetus to make sure that you put 5 houses in there so that first person in didn't go onto an empty street and live there for 3 years, but you really started to build the community right away. So it just feels like the foundation's investment there was really important in making this have the impact that you wanted it to have in this community.
Well, it kind of dovetails with some other things that we've got going on in that area in terms of creating basically a new entrance into what is referred to as Uptown, an area that we are working really hard to revitalize. And so we kind of tried, the 5 Points neighborhood is kind of tied to that. And we've got some other projects on the drawing board that tie into that will help revitalize the entire neighborhood in that area.
Yeah. I was going to ask this question. I'll just give you a chance to elaborate a little bit, but you just started to speak to how the impact of this housing development really aligns with the mission and vision that the foundation has. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, one of the things that we've been looking at in our new strategic plan was connecting more with our community and having a place to be where people want to live and work and so forth. So the housing issue is a major. I think it's across the country. It's a major issue. It's a major issue here, and to be quite frankly, with the biggest challenge that we had going, once we got into it. And I don't want to think you might think this was an easy, because it has not been an easy road. We've learned so much, and to the point that I look forward to the next project because I won't make as many mistakes as we made in this past one. But for example, I think it sounds easy to just say, we're going to build these homes, and somebody are going to come in. People are just going to come in, occupy the homes. Everything's going to go great. When we first started advertising for 5 Points, we were starting with the 12 cottage homes, and in the first week we had 87 applications to Virginia Housing for a home at 5 Points. And I'm giddy. I'm like, wow, we're gonna, how are we going to just decide on 12 people for these homes? And how can we get more? Well, a week or so later, I found out that of the 87 applications, we had 0 people who actually would qualify for the loan, which basically exposed a whole different set of problems for us. And that is that we had people in our community who had the desire to be homeowners who, for whatever reason, the banking structure, the financing arm of this, they couldn't qualify. And so we really felt the need that I didn't feel like we could just walk away from those 87 people. So we began to work in earnest with the United Way and some of the programs and other smaller agencies around in trying to work with individuals to get them ready to be able to buy homes. We have a Bridges Out of Poverty program going with our local United Way. So we've really focused in on, how can we help build that pipeline while we're still trying to sell the homes. There's another problem that was identified. It was an unintended consequence that, we really couldn't just walk away from and ignore.
Yeah. I wonder if you could speak to any internal barriers or policies or anything that sort of got in the way as you tried to do this deal, and what did you do about them?
I would say internally, we didn't have any problems in our foundation or board with policy procedures. The city was a great partner. Our biggest problem came with an outside agency. It actually caused us to increase the price of the home by 20%. And that was because we had a 2-month delay with DEQ over the property. And that 2-month delay put us right in the middle of the pandemic. And then we couldn't get the homes off the line at Nationwide. And by the time we got to that point, with the cost increase in terms of materials, the price of the homes went up by 20%. We had originally targeted these homes around 125 to 130. And at the end, we're having to sell them at about 150, 155 because of the cost increase.
Yeah. Housing is a complicated thing to step into as an initial investment. So kudos
Without
to
a
you
doubt.
all.
Well,
Yep.
and I will say, give you a quick update on the property. We've placed the first 5 homes, and we actually want another thing that we just, you don't know what you don't know. But we thought, great, it'll just be real easy to sell these things. We ended up bringing on a realtor. We had experience in working with financing through HUD and various different places, and it was the best decision we made. We have sold 1 house. We have 3 under contract. And once we close out on those, we're at that number 4 where we can now manufacture the next 5 homes. So that was one of the things we learned very early on. We didn't know that a person couldn't qualify for a HUD loan if the appliances weren't included in the house. So, just in connecting with her, we had to go back and we put the appliances in so that it would allow individuals to go through HUD as far as qualifying for a loan. So they're like I said, we've learned a great deal.
So I'll ask you one final question, and then we'll bring Stephanie into this conversation, wearing a different hat for a few minutes. But I wonder, I know that you have, the Harvest Foundation has addressed both the long game and the short game. You do have a policy. You've gone through a process of sort of creating the institutional support for this work and stepped out and done the 5 points investment. What advice would you offer other foundations on this call who are stepping into this local investing, sort of moving beyond the grant maker only role into local investing?
Well, I think one of the things, especially when we, internally, we've looked at when we discovered the issue with the qualification and people not being able to qualify, we realized that down the road, we've got to look at some type of different financing mechanism in order to keep things affordable and to get the people that we're trying to help into these homes, or to give them the opportunity for home ownership and to build wealth. And I would say anybody going into this, there are some risk involved, and don't be afraid to step out. I mean, I'm lucky that we've got a board that says this is a risk worth taking. I think where our next project, we'll be looking at more in terms of how we get more involved in helping to finance these for the individuals that we're truly targeting in terms of that affordable housing market. So I see us becoming maybe more involved on that end in some capacity. Now, I think there's a lot more work to be done before we venture into that, but I sense that there's a willingness to take that risk in order to help people move forward. And I'll share this really quick. One of the people that we worked with through the qualifications, was very frustrating to see a person who had been living in an apartment, I would say a substandard housing situation for almost 10 years, paying close to $800 a month, never missed a payment, and a loan for one of these homes that would have been less than her monthly mortgage, her monthly rent payment she's making, but because of some pre-existing issues as far as the medical debt or some of those things, not able to qualify. So here you got a person who's working really hard to make ends meet, paying more than they would pay for a mortgage, but because they can't get into that system in terms of mortgage financing because of the pre-existing debt, and finding a way to work with people and taking those people and putting them in different buckets and saying, this group needs this group needs this one's about a year away, this one may be 3 or 4 years away, but at least having a pathway that they can follow to, if they're willing to follow that, to where they can get into that home ownership realm. And so I just say, don't be afraid to get out there and take some risks.
That's great. Thank you for that. And I think it's really encouraging to think about the investment that you made, which was essentially a guarantee that these houses would move, and to think about that, which is a little bit safer investment in some way, has encouraged you all to think about how you take on more risk next time. So to have the impact that you want. So thank you for that. And we're going to open it up to questions after we have a chance to talk to Stephanie and then hear from Leah a little bit. But Stephanie, I'm going to turn to you, and we've asked Stephanie to take off her session facilitator hat and put on her Cassiopeia / Blue Moon / Purple Tiger hat. Stephanie, the same question, just sort of place Cassiopeia and the foundation in the context of the state and where you were when you made this investment.
Yeah, so, again, as I said during my introduction, the foundation had a deep history of doing impact investing, but we were an environmental foundation, and a lot of our investments were in Louisiana, and as well as across the globe. We were not a funder or investor with a deep presence in Charlottesville. And I would say that our impact investing strategy was, prior to 5 years ago, strongly market rate focused, becoming a mission aligned investor, and then doing PRIs, program related investments, low market rate or concessionary lending, that while the recovery of capital was not the expectation per IRS guidelines of this term, the sincere hope was that we were going to be successful. But if not, we could wipe it all free and it would be a 100% negative returning. We'd just call it a grant. And so there was kind of like this bifurcation of those two spectrums, that we wanted it to happen, but if it didn't, we just make it all a grant. And we had no local context. We weren't here in Charlottesville. And when the pandemic happened, I credit our board for saying, we have experience doing disaster response from our work in Louisiana. We know that money, general operating, cash on the ground quickly is the most important things communities can do at this moment. And so we ramped up our efforts to start doing a ton of grant making locally, to the tune of, I think in 9 months, we gave over $6 million into the Charlottesville footprint. And I was literally picking up the phone, calling organizations day 2, day 3 of the closure, who had no idea who I was, saying, I need a half an hour of your time so that I could end the conversation with a grant of some sort, just to clarify who they were. And sometimes I was even having to convince people to take calls with me because they didn't have a clue who the heck I was. And our strategy was focused around mental health. It was focused around food access. And then we were really concerned about the business community that makes Charlottesville unique. And this project that we're going to talk about is really about access to capital and how are we going to help small businesses, particularly small businesses owned by marginalized individuals. We're going to be able to adapt. And as this was developing, everyone was trying to figure this out. The government was trying to figure this out. We're like, well, we're giving nonprofits flexible capital so that they can iterate and adapt and begin to figure out how to keep their doors open and serve their clients. We need to give that same gift to businesses. As we were thinking about this, the federal government came out with PPP. And we very quickly saw that, well, guess what? People who don't have existing access and existing relationships with banking communities are not going to get these dollars. They're going to come and go so fast. And it was so complicated. And so we needed a different partner to reach those other communities. Let me stop there and let you ask the next question.
Yes. So let's dig into the opportunity now. How did it come to you? I assume it landed on your desk, but what's the process that you used to say, are we going to make this investment?
Well, and again, we didn't have a relationship with people in Charlottesville. It wasn't what we do. So it didn't land in our desk. I actually went and picked up the phone and sought this one out. We do not, at the time, we did not have a CDFI that had an office in Charlottesville. Virginia Community Capital does serve our area. And I was talking to Jane Henderson, who at the time was the CEO of VCC. And I said, we're really interested in small businesses and really the micro lending small businesses. And she said, look at Community Investment Collaborative, which we lovingly call CIC. CIC was not a CDFI at the time, but they are now. And they had an almost 10-year history of providing small business development training and coaching alongside some SBDC services to small businesses. And they had developed a revolving loan fund that they were using to help support small businesses. And their largest loan, I think, when we first spoke with them, was up to $15,000. So these were really like $5,000 to $15,000 loans that they were giving out on a regular basis, and they had great success. And right as Jane said that to me, I was reading the news of what was going on and how the city was responding, and both the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County provided them a total of $300,000 to establish 2 loan funds for small businesses, again, particularly targeting marginalized community. One was called a business resiliency fund that was giving up to $10,000 at 1%. And then a second fund they called the business recovery fund, a little confusing, which one was which. No, I'm backwards. The resiliency fund, the recovery fund was for anybody up to 1%. And the resiliency loan was an equity focused fund which allowed business owners from marginalized communities to receive an additional $5,000 to up to 3% to expand the amount of capital. And it seemed like they had already thought of the infrastructure, but I was like, $300,000 is not enough money. And so we began an internal conversation about, well, what if we double this? You know, what is the demand that they're going to expect before it's even formally launched? And how do we double it? So I picked up the phone and called the CEO of Community Investment Collaborative and said, I think this is a great idea. What do you expect? Do you think you could double this pool? And, what failure rate are you expecting? He's like, we've never done anything like this. He's like, they were underwriting these loans based on, could you have repaid the amount of this loan based on your earnings in March of the previous year? And that was the only underwriting they were looking at. Would you have that? Did you have that amount of cash flow happening? It's like, so we really have no idea. It could be as high as 50%. But we wanted to help them do it.
So talk about how you structured your investment and why you've hinted at it with that up to 50% number, but talk a bit about how you structured it.
Yeah, Stephen Davis, who runs CIC, really felt like that number could absolutely be doubled, that they had the internal capacity to manage $600,000 of a loan pool. And they believed, based on like the first 24 hours of this program being announced, that they could meet that demand. They had volunteers in the community who were coming to help do the underwriting, and their staff was still working. So they felt confident that they could manage the 600,000. And so we began this internal conversation. And it's helpful to share at this point in time that we're a foundation that's not a fan of grants, especially the negative 100% grant, especially when you're focused on markets and businesses, and you want to try to help create some accountability and build self-sufficiency in the project. Now, there are things that we all want to always be and always should be 100% neighbors, 100%, because the social and environmental impact is so high. There are some things I feel like philanthropy is shortchanging the opportunity by not putting a financial return challenge on that. And so through my work in rural communities, I've really been pushing this idea internally of, well, what if we just start doing grant making strategies as recoverable grants that only give us back 50% of our money? We could do twice as much. And there's all kinds of ancillary benefits that would happen. So we thought about the traditional loan of a PRI at 2%, which is kind of where that structure starts as an opportunity. But well, they're not lending out at 2%. So, okay, what if we just did a 2%, a 0% loan? Okay, well, do we structure it as a PRI? I'm like, no, it's a recoverable grant. If you want to avoid a legal opinion, or the easiest way to avoid making that case is to keep it in the grant section. So we structured it as a recoverable grant, and had to walk Stephen through what is recoverable grant and build out a promissory note structure that convinced him that he was only going to have to that which he got, that we were not going to hold him accountable to any of those losses. And so, the pandemic really created the opportunity for me to start pushing this recoverable grant. What if the expectation is getting 50 or 75% of our money back? We could do more and still meet our payout requirements and increase our impact. And so, through a variety of conversations, we ended up structuring it as a 0% recoverable grant that is now in year 2.5. That lasted over 4 years.
Yeah. So you've alluded a little bit to this, Stephanie, but what are some of the internal barriers, conversations, policy discussions you had to have to do that? Because it didn't fit the traditional PRI 2% when CIC was putting the money out there at such a low interest rate.
And this was a funny conversation because we did not want to put CIC through the typical underwriting process that we go through. They were already trying to deal with more than they had ever experienced in their young lives. And so us coming up with, what's our comfort level? Process does not exist as it should, and it doesn't need to be. So how are we going to make this? And I think the first question was, are we willing to lose $300,000 to support businesses? And once we got clarity that we were comfortable with that risk, then the conversation became really easy. So for me, it was, let's start with how much risk are we willing to take? You know, are we expecting any of this back? And the answer was really no. And so we started kind of wrestling with but wanting to continue to push that spectrum of accountability. I also learned in my initial 45-minute conversation with Stephen that they were looking to become a CDFI. That they just prior to the onset of the pandemic had built out a plan to become a CDFI, to increase their lending pool, which from the time I think maxed out at 15,000, as I said, that could go all the way up to 50,000. And then in a few years, they wanted to grow it up to $100,000 to expand their marketplace. And so we really felt that by doing a loan and having it be recoverable was giving them some traction and a case record, unlike running the revolving loan fund that was strictly grant funded from the city, of having a repayment history with a funder. So that kind of what our losses were, what our risk tolerance was, and what was their growth and what trajectory were they on were really the two key factors that made us say, let's do this as a recoverable grant. And then just the cost savings of avoiding a PRI, tax returns.
So interesting, because it speaks to the fact that foundations can factor in a lot more dimensions in this decision than a lot of other financiers out there can do. So that was great. Can you speak a little bit to the impact or that this investment had and how that aligned with the mission of Cassiopeia, especially given that you weren't really a place-based investor at this time?
That is true. Well, the foundation was created in 1944 by my boss's grandfather. And according to the 2-page documentation that they filed with the IRS, our mission is the betterment of mankind. So we have a lot of leeway from the legal definition and structure of what our foundation does. But for the COVID strategy, ultimately our goal was we wanted to increase the resiliency and capacity of our small businesses to stay open and meet the needs of our community during an unprecedented challenge. And we wanted to give them the capital they needed to stay open and hopefully springboard opportunity when the pandemic ended, which we thought back in April of 2020 would be by the end of the summer. And so, what I'm excited to say is that between our investment and the city and the county's investment, that $600,000 pool, and I have to actually look at notes because I'm horrible at quoting numbers, that $600,000 pool of small loans, none of which were over $10,000, has provided over $787,000 of loans to small businesses, and over 89 different loans were made. As of 3 months ago, only 2 loans were past due in their payments. Several of them have been repaid, and the 2 that are past due are working on just different repayment terms. But perhaps the best trajectory of showing how these loans helped and how the small business resources CIC was providing at the same time helped is kind of tracking 2 different survey that they did. They asked those that received loans to kind of track how close were they to achieving their pre-pandemic revenue. And in December of 2020, basically 9 months after this loan, our loan to them went out, only 26% of the businesses said that they were experiencing 75% of their pre-pandemic revenue. So 26% of the businesses had achieved 75% of their pre-pandemic revenue. In October of 2021, that number had gone up to nearly 60% of the businesses, and none had gone out of business.
It's pretty impressive impressive. Well, let me end on this this part of the conversation, at least, Stephanie, by saying, so you have peers and colleagues on this call. What advice would you give to other foundations that are stepping into this?
Well, I think one of the mistakes that we made, and I think anytime you're, and I kind of slapped myself for missing the obvious in this one. They were using volunteer labor to make this happen. But I really believe that anytime you're asking an organization to increase their business and make a loan to them, make a grant to help them cover their costs as well. They were giving out loans at 1%. That meant they were not making any money. They had volunteer labor, but they certainly weren't covering their costs either. And so I think that was a mistake on our part to not offer it up. And I had a conversation with Stephen and I said, and it's a mistake on your part not to ask the question. I think that's the biggest thing that I would have changed. The other thing is now they're sitting on, those loans are being repaid and they're still allowed to make loans under the original uses of the original terms of the agreement. But now they're starting to sit on a pile of cash that they don't have to pay back for another 2 years. Or I think we're down to 18 months at this point in time. And so we're working on creating an addendum to that original agreement that says, well, how else can they use these dollars rather than these two restrictive purposes that could serve similar needs? I think that would have just been too much bandwidth for any of us to imagine back in April of 2020, what those extra uses would be. And we honestly weren't expecting them to have this repayment success, to have thought of that problem, but that's obviously an oversight that we have at this point in time that you may consider.
Great. Well, thank you to both DeWitt and Stephanie for sharing those stories. And I just want to offer just a really simple, quick insight from some of the work that we've been doing with a group of foundations in Indiana in partnership with the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, equivalent organization to VFN. But we've been working with a group of 5 community foundations that are building local investment strategies. And one of those foundations, which is a rural foundation, had one of their current grantees come and ask for a significant grant. And they said, we can't do a grant that big, but what about a bridge loan? You know, this was a grantee that had a source of income down the road, but they were trying to get started now. And so the foundation, they didn't have a policy. They were definitely moving toward that long, but they weren't there yet. And being able to come in with a current grantee that they knew well, which meant their due diligence on this was a little bit easier because of the relationship, and able to go out with a short-term bridge loan that allowed them to benefit that grantee, but also to do something that was really outside the bounds of what they could do with a grant alone. So lots of entry points for this. I wanted to give Mary Fandonen, who was going to join our panel, but is in transit today. Mary, I don't know if you're with us by phone, if you have good access, but I just wonder if there's anything from Stephanie and DeWitt's sharing of their investments that you might want to touch on. Just, can you give us a couple of minutes if you have good access? And if not, we'll understand. I'm not hearing Mary. If not, we'll go on.
Somebody is on a phone, but I can't tell for sure whose number it is, but there is somebody who is on just with a phone.
It's Mary's phone number, but she may, wait. Hi, Mary.
Hey, y'all. I am not where I can talk, and I have not had internet to be listening until just a few minutes ago. So, well, Deb, thank you, but
sure.
I think I better pass for now.
Okay, that's fine, Mary. Just wanted to give you the opportunity. Thanks. Travel safe. Travel safe. Well, I'm going to do one more short interview with Leah Freemel, because all of these stories that we've heard, the examples that Stephanie gave early on, DeWitt's story, Stephanie's story, featured a lot of partners. I mean, this really is about an ecosystem and not just a foundation or a CDFI out there. And so Stephanie and I thought it'd be really great to ask Leah to join us for a little while, who is both a participant in the ecosystem in her role with Bridging Virginia, but also really help to stand up the CDFI coalition in the states. So Leah, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself, and then just to start with, how would you describe the investment ecosystem in Virginia for the foundations on the call?
Great, Deb, thank you, and thanks to VFN for hosting me and having these discussions. I think the learning, I heard DeWitt say it, Deb, Stephanie, others that have spoken today have said the learning and the kind of experience that we can share here in these rooms, but also out in the work that is really important to the innovation and what we can achieve for our communities. So thank you for hosting these. Leah Freemel, in context for this conversation, I am the board president of the newly formed Virginia CDFI Coalition. This organization literally just filed its paperwork about maybe 45 days ago at the federal level. So we're waiting anxiously to get our tax ID from the IRS. But that group formed in 2021 in response to a state allocation that we got through the General Assembly to create a Virginia CDFI fund. And so that fund was a Hail Mary COVID success story. So we, at the end of 2020, there was a small group of us that said, we think the state can do something through CDFIs to help the businesses. And it turned into a $10 million grant pool at one of our state agencies, that when you then when you blast out to the 18 certified CDFIs, but then there's some other loan funds like Bridging Virginia and others that do lending in communities. Hey, we've got $10 million from the state. How do we spend it? People show up for those meetings, and they show up for those meetings monthly for now almost 2 years. So it'll be 2 years in 2023 that group has not only met consistently, identified goals and strategies for what we want to do, but has actually expanded. Technically, there are only 18 certified CDFIs in the state of Virginia, but there are probably 30 plus organizations on these monthly calls. Almost all of us, except maybe a partner or a business support organization, deal in capital or provide some sort of financing or investment tools. And we're there because we now have a voice for the sector and the work that we're doing as intermediaries and as CDFIs. And so not only talking about how we share and partner, but we're bringing in resources and presenters that talk about guarantee pools and how do we work with foundations, and creating secondary markets through some national funds that want to work in Virginia. So back to the learning pieces that you all are doing here, we are also trying to do that through the work we're doing through that organization. So excited to talk more about that, and the fact that the ecosystem around investment, I think it tends, in my experience, and I think others in the coalition, and I think some of us, maybe Caroline, she's on the call here too, she can jump in, would say that it tends to be somewhat hyper-local. So we have place-based foundations, or we have healthcare conversion foundations, and they have specific communities, mandates, and areas of focus that focus them and target them in very specific ways. And so if you fit into those markets or those communities, it can be a very healthy ecosystem for you as a intermediary CDFI or a community member that benefits from these services. Areas that don't have a strong investment community, or even a philanthropic partner, or even I would say an embedded CDFI, this is a little sparse. Several of us, and I think that you will get a list of the CDFI members and the target markets that they serve, geographic markets, and also where they're headquartered. That's all in that list. But you see, several of us are statewide, but technically on paper. But if we don't have people with boots on the ground in the community, it really is hard to build trust. To, if you think about it from a purely sales standpoint, where we're trying to generate loans, how are you in that market, finding the small businesses, finding the homeowners, et cetera, if you're not there a couple of days a week, from the lending side. The other piece is the hard stuff that DeWitt mentioned earlier. We can create these programs and we can have all the capital in the world. But if the community member or the homeowner or the business owner isn't ready for that, then it's just going to sit there. And so a lot of what we do when we are embedded and connected and trusted in the community is that support work and that capacity building work. And so when you don't have that, like Southern Virginia does not have a lot. And so that's like the Lynchburg, Danville area. There are resources there, but it's not as healthy as I would say Central Virginia, which is the Richmond area, Charlottesville, even up and down 81. There is more like Stanton Community Capital now, and some others that credit unions and things from Northern Virginia kind of feed that corridor. So, but there are definitely sparse areas of the state that intermediary lender or a CDFI could help spur some activity.
Yeah. So help us, again, the foundations on here are, and I think you were on from the very beginning when we did the poll. People are actively, a good number of folks are actively trying to deploy capital. So how can foundations be better partners with financial intermediaries like CDFIs? What kind of behaviors would you like to see?
Well, one is the learning, and that's very evident here today that the foundations are learning and trying to innovate. Mary, I think, is still on the call. I got to work with her in my role at VCC, and we had a PRI through the Allegheny Foundation, and and my team was responsible for the ecosystem and the technical assistant work. That PRI and that investment started with real estate development in mind. But in partnership with Mary and other local leaders, after about a year of trying to figure out the real estate stuff, it became clearer that it was a small business community that needed attention and focus. And so with the foundation in partnership, we pivoted the expectations around the activity and how the money could be used. And I'll tell you, over 3 years, we did not deploy a single loan. The market wasn't ready. The business owners weren't ready. But I think that what we did do was bring in additional capacity through the Advancement Foundation, things that the EDA were starting to happen differently, and the chamber. But again, that learning and that pivoting and innovation, that was be crucial to that. The other piece is, and I'm glad DeWitt shared the example he did, because this stuff is hard. And we're not transforming communities in a year or 2 years. And a lot of the investment, again, my experience, a lot of the investments and grants that I have been involved in have timeframes of 2 to 3 years around a performance period. And so when we're transforming communities, 2 to 3 years is not enough time to show significant results, if any results. Allegheny PRI as a great example. And so expectations from the beginning of when you're entering into a partnership or a grant investment or an investment, what is the goal for that money? And, and what is reasonable as far as you funding that intermediary or that nonprofit to do the work? And how are you helping them achieve those transformational goals? Because it's not cut and dry, and it changes almost every transaction or even relationship that you build.
Yeah. So, Leah, we're going to follow up with some resources, but what do you think the foundations, what are some of the pathways to actually understand the ecosystem, to find those partners? And I know you have deep experience with CDFIs, but there's other sorts of partners out there, the city, the United Way that DeWitt talked about. What do you think? How do foundations learn about these potential partners? What are some of the resources out there?
I think it would depend on your foundation's reputation currently in the area and how big or small you are, as far as authentically engaging with the partners and in the work. And if you have a program officer that can be at those meetings and be at those events and be seen and be part of the boots on the ground work, if you have that ability, that's where the trust and the learning is really going to come in, because it is that practical experience feeding up into the investment committee that's going to make that investment truly match the need of the community. And that's one way. The other way is that, being sometimes the bigger entity or the perceived, big money in the room, sometimes it's best for you to stand back and let the money do the work. Let the organization tell you what is needed, and be okay with not knowing how it's going to go. Or, and maybe not even getting credit for the grant. Sometimes being behind the curtain, and letting the be the face of the program and be the face of the work is actually better long-term, because it builds capacity and empowerment in the funded organization. And so those are cultural things. Those are kind of probably a grant by grant, program by program discussion, but I think it's being comfortable, one, not knowing how it's going to go, and two, not being comfortable not getting credit for some of the investments on special circumstances.
Yeah. Any final words of wisdom? We're going to open it up just to general questions, but anything, final words of wisdom for the foundations on the call?
Yeah, I think what I've heard today, some of you are already using your balance sheets differently. The guarantees and backing up the financing that Cdfis and others are doing. Sometimes it isn't cash out the door. It really is just the power of your balance sheet that can move that deal forward. So don't underestimate that. And then I've not ever worked for a foundation, but my impression is that culturally things kind of move a little slow sometimes as far as changing and getting committees on board and stuff like that. And so where are some of continue to look for kind of the organizational decisions you can make and move and try and innovate, while you're getting the infrastructure and the culture kind of shifted to the new.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Leah. That's great. We wanted to bring Leah in just to kind of speak to that bigger ecosystem of partners out there. And again, we've given Patty a whole set of resources, and we've got a couple more that we'll give her that she'll get out to folks. But want to open it up for questions or comments. Those of you, what did we have? 40% of you who are actively deploying investments, but if there are some comments that you'd like to make about the way that you've structured these, or how you think you've taken sort of short game steps to get into this work and learn by doing. I'm happy to open it up at this point, and maybe we could not spotlight me and put everybody up for a minute, if that would be okay.